Good morning, fans. Today we're going to talk about a trade that most likely would not have happened in the era of free agency. We had two pitchers, both of whom were in their mid to late 20s. They've had quite a bit of success with their respective teams, and they both thought that they deserved a substantial raise. But this was in the era of the dreaded reserve clause. And for those of you who don't know, the reserve clause was basically a contractual agreement that bound a player to the last team that he played for in the next season. And essentially, it bound a player with the team in perpetuity. Now, interestingly enough, the reserve clause was not always met with derision by players. In the very early days of professional baseball, the players who were chosen to have the reserve clause tended to be the best players. And so, at first, the reserve clause was seen as a compliment. You want me next year? I feel honored for that. But over the years, the reserve clause became a means of controlling labor. It expanded to all the players in professional baseball. And what it did was it had the effect of depressing the labor market for baseball players. And that meant when it came to asking for a raise, the players were pretty much at the mercy of the owners. And whether or not they would get a raise often had more to do with the generosity of the owners than on the specific performance of the players. And, the owners were not known for being very generous. So the only leverage that a player had was the holdout. That was to withhold their labor in order to force the issue and to force the owner to come to terms with their demands. But this was a dangerous strategy, as you may believe, because back in those days the teams were owned a lot of times by the same families. It was considered a very close business, and if you started a labor dispute where you would hold out, that created bad feelings and bad blood. And the bitter feelings would hamper the ability of the players in the team to continue to get along. That was the case in February of 1972. 2 seasons earlier, Cardinals pitcher Steve Carlton wanted to increase his salary. He was making about $26,000 a year. He wanted to earn about $50,000 a year. The Cardinals offered $31,000. And Carlton decided that he was going to sit out the spring training for the 1970 seasons. And after sitting out for spring training, relations with Carlton and with Cardinals owner Gussie Busch fell to a low. It is such a low that even after Carlton had 20 wins in 1971, Busch ordered that Carlton to be traded. Now, meanwhile, we had Rick Wise with the Phillies, and Wise was doing well with the Phillies also. His salary after 7 years was also around the $26,000 range, and he thought that he deserved a substantial raise. He again wanted to double his money around the $50,000 range. And, despite having 17 wins this season before, and despite having an ERA of 2.88 and throwing a no-hitter in 1971, the Phillies weren't budging on salary. So what was the solution? It was a straight-up trade for the two pitchers, Rick Wise for Steve Carlton. Now, initially, the trade was not popular with Phillies fans. Wise was a big fan favorite in Philadelphia, and Carlton was not happy either in the lack of say that he had over where he was going. So, it was an unpopular trade, and ironically, both players wound up signing for the amount of money they wanted with their new teams. So both players were earning about $65,000 in the 1972 season. It was just a trade that wasn't so much about money as about control and management saying to the players, you're not going to treat us this way, so we view you as a problem, we're just going to ship you off to somewhere else. Now, Rick Wise, knowing that this is what happened, he's concluded and he's quoted as saying that the trade was just basically ridiculous when you look back on it. Now, the results of the trade are well known to Phillies fans. In 1972, Carlton won 27 games and accounted for 46%, about 46% of the Phillies' victory that year. He won Cy Young with a last-place team, and he became a fan favorite in Philadelphia. He won 4 Cy Youngs while he was here. He became, at one point, he was the strikeout king in the 1980s, and to this day is still number 4 on the list and number 2 for left-handed pitchers. And he and his devastating slider was one of the main reasons why the Phillies won the 1980 World Championship. Rick Wise, meanwhile, sometimes he tends to be seen as the forgotten part of the deal. He's the answer to the trivia question, who did the Phillies trade to get Steve Carlton? But quite frankly, Rick Wise had a respectable career afterwards. He pitched another 11 years in the majors, and even though he lasted with the Cardinals for only another 2 years, he was still a solid pitcher. But it was the ill will that was generated by the salary dispute in an age when the players had no bargaining power. And that put into motion the trade that many Phillies fans now consider to be the team's best trade in its long history.